episode of the Atlas Society Asks. I'm Jennifer Grossman. My friends know me as JAG. I am the CEO of the Atlas Society. We're the leading nonprofit organization introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in fun, creative ways, like our graphic novels, pocket guides, animated videos, and social media. I'm joined today by my colleague, Professor Jason Hill, who is one of the senior scholars at the Atlas Society, and without whom this interview would probably not be taking place, since he's the one who brought Jonathan Emord and his excellent new book, The Authoritarians, to my attention. I'm going to introduce Jonathan, but before I do that, I wanted to remind all of you who are watching us on Zoom, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube, please go ahead and start typing your comments or your questions into the comment stream. We're really going to try to get to as many of them as we can, so have at it. Jonathan Emord is one of the nation's top constitutional lawyers. He's the author of 5 books, including Freedom, Technology, and the First Amendment, Global Censorship of Health Information, and most recently, The Authoritarians, Their Assault on Individual Liberty, the Constitution, and Free Enterprise from the 19th century to the present. Throughout his 35-year career practicing constitutional and administrative law before federal courts, he has worked to achieve full First Amendment protection for speech and for the press, and he has the unique distinction of having defeated the FDA 8 times in federal court, more than any other attorney in America. Jonathan, welcome again, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So I am going to let my colleague, Professor Hill, jump in here in just a moment, but I wanted to first get to one of your earlier books, which was The Rise of Tyranny. You focused on the delegation of legislative, executive, and judicial powers to, I was surprised to learn, over 200 independent regulatory commissions since the 1930s. Regulatory agencies that enact over 90% of all federal law. You pointed out a tendency of such agencies to become captives of the industries that they regulate, citing the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry as an example and a case for concern. I'm just curious, given where we are right now, in the many years after that book was written, have your concerns been affected one way or the other with the experience of the pandemic and the government's response?
Yes, I think it's gotten worse. The association between government and industry, I think, is closer today than ever before, all across the board, particularly in the communications area. We have big tech that is essentially performing a censorship role for the government. So it is at the suggestion of leaders in the Democratic Party taking action to censor conservative communication. And it comes in a form that traditional jurisprudence doesn't seem to latch onto. A lot of parties have said, hey, look, this is not censorship. Censorship only is that which is brought about by the government. These are private parties. They're exercising independent editorial control over their fora. The problem with that argument is that they bought into a regulatory regime where they became common carriers. And they argued to the government at the time that it passed the Communications Act, the amendments, that they were a common carrier, that they would not engage in editorial discrimination. They wouldn't delete communication based on its content. And indeed, they were given legal protection against liability for that. Well, they've violated that trust in that now actually they're very, very much tied to leading Democrats And they have enabled Democrats to win elective office in no small measure because of censorship of information. And they are promoting, for example, a complete censorship of alternatives to a standard vaccine treatment for COVID. The mere suggestion of other treatments is blocked on the web. Any effort in that regard. So that's just one example. There are many examples that we could discuss, but that's an example, I think, of that extension. I would say that it does violate the First Amendment because the First Amendment does restrict government, but when government uses industry to achieve its own ends, that is a government action, and I think it should be recognized as such.
You also wrote Global Censorship of Health Information at least a decade prior to current concerns about to what extent information about COVID, its origins, potential therapies, and vaccine efficacy and side effects is being filtered according to political interests. And while that book focuses more on efforts of government agencies to limit nutrition claims by food supplements companies, one of the things that I found most striking, having run a nutrition institute myself and having tangled with the FDA in the past over simply wanting to say, you know, bananas are you know, have potassium and they might be good for this health concern, and having been told that, you know, we absolutely couldn't do things like that. But just how absent in the current discussion about COVID is nutrition and diet when it comes to reducing your risk of COVID. So do some of the dynamics that you identified in the book have implications that have skewed the way that we're thinking about immunity in the face of a contagious virus?
Very definitely. We have a government voice that in this instance, the government is saying that's the only voice that may be heard, that any other competing voice is considered not only one to be debated, beyond that, it's one to be censored. And so they are not allowing a multiplicity of voices about scientific information. Science is somehow considered to be holy when it's communicated from the government platform. But when science arises elsewhere, they censor it. When science becomes competitive with that view articulated by government, they get rid of it. This is Lysenkoism. This is a form of Lysenkoism, and it is censorship. And what happens is a large amount of information, particularly in the area of nutrition, but also in the area of drugs, is kept away from people so that they go completely unaware of what they should do in order to reduce the severity of the disease if they contract it. For example, just one example, omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3 fatty acids, there's an enormous amount of literature supporting their anti-inflammatory role. Inflammation is a key factor in the progression of this disease, with the spike proteins wreaking havoc throughout your body and all your organ systems. So omega-3 fatty acids consumed daily not only reduce the risk of vascular disease, as I proved and won a case over that matter against the FDA, it also, you know, eliminates inflammation, helps reduce inflammation. Also, such things as if you go to any hospital and you have COVID-like symptoms, they'll frequently prescribe ibuprofen. Ibuprofen actually increases the number of ACE2 receptor cells in your body, thus causing the disease to expand, that is, to become more prolific throughout your body. So you certainly don't want to take ibuprofen, but there's no allowance for discussion of this in the marketplace. What you should be taking is aspirin instead, because aspirin doesn't have that effect, and it's also a pain reliever. Aspirin is far more effective because it doesn't increase the number of ACE2 receptors. This is just a little bit of the information. Ivermectin, for example, and hydroxychloroquine, world round, have been found to be effective therapies. The evidence that, for example, ivermectin is effective in treating COVID, and particularly when administered early on with symptoms, is extraordinary. Many people have had their lives saved by ivermectin, and yet and hydroxychloroquine. And yet, because Dr. Fauci has ruled them out as treatments and is focusing entirely on the vaccine, which increasingly becomes a treatment because the vaccine isn't what they promised it would be, people are denied access to that information. The consequence is grave. There are people who are dying in America because they do not know that they ought to be taking ivermectin or that they ought to try hydroxychloroquine. And any debate as to the scientific merits of that is just eliminated entirely from the market. And the effect of that is, of course, to rob us of innovation. We only innovate in science, as we do in most areas, by an open marketplace of ideas in which individuals are allowed to contest. And we are given the privilege of reading it all and evaluating for ourselves what we consider to be in our own best interest. This, in classic collectivist thinking, the government has said, oh, no, we're the experts and we'll divine for you what is right. And what we say is everyone should be vaccinated. And that's the only answer. They're Luddites. The only thing they offer is a vaccine. And now they're embarrassed because their vaccine is not as effective as they promised. It looks as though after 4 or 5 months, the degree of immunity drops precipitously. And so what do? They don't look for innovation. They don't invite it. They don't invite the critics of the vaccine who are in the scientific community to offer opinion. Instead, they say, oh, no, get more vaccines. Be vaccinated again and again and again. So you'll be a person who's riddled with spike proteins delivered by the vaccine. There's no long-term safety studies on those. There's no long-term safety study indicating the extent to which multiple injections with these spike proteins into your body will cause problems for you down the road. So I'd rather stick with things that we know. Ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine have an enormous history of safe use across the world. So why not give it a go if that's a safer approach? But they won't let us say that.
Well, I want to switch gears now to your most recent book, The Authoritarians. It is a historically and philosophically sweeping account of the 19th century to the present, of trends and efforts to undermine constitutional limits on government. Yet and I want to bring Professor Hill in here because he was absolutely passionately been recommending that we get you on the show. And so perhaps, Jason, you can kick it off by telling us what it was that you found most salient and most important about this book at this time.
Well, a number of things. And again, welcome, Jonathan, to the show. It's so great to have you here. I'd read a number of texts or books on, America's decline and on America's precipitous road towards authoritarianism. But what I had not really encountered was a sort of minute and detailed historical research on the antecedents, right? Most of us, sort of myself included, although I have read a lot of critical theory and I've read a lot of German idealism, and I've been acquainted with the Frankfurt School, I've done work with them for over a decade, I've not taken the time to explain to people when they say, well, how do we get here? I've said, well, the 60s, and it's easy to point to the 60s, and Jonathan's not satisfied with resting with the 60s. He points to the decline of classical liberalism and the decline of America going back to 19th century Germany, and ties the philosopher John Dewey's philosophy of education and his progressivism and his brand of socialism, along with Franklin D. Roosevelt. And today we would call these people woke. Well, where did their wokeism arise? It arose from a philosophic system in 19th century Germany. And that's the thing I found fascinating about Jonathan's book, that he did this legwork that could explain to people that this did not just arise out of a vacuum, nor did it arise out of the 1960s. The 1960s, those individuals are the legatees, the beneficiaries of a philosophic system that they inherited. It's taken a long time for the chickens to come home and roost, but the eggs have finally hatched, and we see these ugly ducklings walking around who are destroying our culture. So kudos to this book and to Jonathan for writing this book. Yeah.
Well, I might say that I'm a big fan of yours. And so when you say these things, if I'm not blushing, I should be. I'm very, very humbled by what you say, because I did take a different approach in that I looked at the history anew, and I really start most of my assessment from this constitutional law perspective, which is not, I don't mean to say it's the modern constitutional law, which really is a deconstruction of the Constitution in academia, but it's the founding principles, and asking myself, what are the greatest threats to the founding principles of this country? And that's where I fall upon this history that was shocking to see that in the antebellum South, ideology very akin to what we're seeing now advocated by the far left was commonplace among pro-slavery advocates in the 1830s. That is essentially Hegelian socialism. Collectivism, they called it with Hegel, but it's really the origin, as we know, of socialism. And Karl Marx was a student of Friedrich Hegel, and he merely advanced it to a more applicable and violent ideology that is replicated today in the far left thinking. But to see that this glorious thing, the Declaration of Independence, the second paragraph of which really defines what it means to be an American, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments are instituted among men to protect the rights of the governed, and that just governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. These principles are the very essence of the genius that is the American experiment, and that was kicked off nowhere else in the world and nowhere else since. But here it started. So I look at the threats to that, and nearly 100 years after the founding, we have these enormous struggles arising, and parties that are interested more in efficiency of government, in achieving what they considered to be the common good and imposing it on others. They found these impediments to the exercise of power in the Constitution, and they wished to defeat them. And so people like, for example, many people are shocked by this, but it's in the book in detail, Felix Frankfurter, for example. Felix Frankfurter was a socialist. He, as a boy, he emigrated to the United States, lived in the Bronx, and would go to lectures repeatedly, love them, to hear the socialist speakers, the socialist labor speakers, and communists, who he admired greatly. And he absolutely despised free enterprise. And he shared much in common with Louis Brandeis in this regard, who he viewed as a mentor. And then he went on to become a member of the Fabian Society in England, the precursor of the British labor movement. And he advocated all of the British labor movement policies, which were very socialistic. And then he became a strong advocate in law school of the Progressive Party. And the Progressive Party of 1924 was, if anything, farther to the left of Bernie Sanders today. And then he became very influential with Franklin Roosevelt, and he ended up being the grandfather, or the father, I should say, of the administrative state. His whole concept that administrative law could circumvent the Constitution was overt. He wanted to defeat the separation of powers. He wanted to invest in single hands legislative, executive, and judicial power, and thereby create an autocratic regime, an authoritarian regime that would be independent of the Constitution's allocation of power. And suddenly you have this system by the time of the New Deal where the overwhelming majority of powers exercised are suffering no constitutional check because they're being wielded by institutions that the Constitution doesn't even contemplate. Indeed, the vesting clauses of Articles 1, 2, and 3 would deny the creation of an administrative state, and yet they created it. They didn't do it through constitutional amendment, through Article 5, because they didn't believe in the Constitution. Woodrow Wilson despised the Declaration, for example, major progressive. He believed that, he said that you should get rid of the initial paragraphs in the Declaration because they were just mere surplusage. And he despised the whole concept of limited power. He thought there was no problem that government ought not solve by imposing the will of elites like himself on the population. Now, he couldn't achieve that in his time, but he laid down the marker for it. And it's not just the Democrats who did this, it's also the Republicans who were part and parcel of the expansion of the administrative state. Richard Nixon was a major proponent of the expansion of the administrative state. Of course, we got wage and price controls from Richard Nixon, so little did he respect the free market. So, well, I'm saying too much and not allowing you to ask me questions.
So Jason, I'm going to let you ask a couple more questions, but we also have a few questions from our audience that I'd love to run by you, Jonathan. Scott on YouTube asks, is anyone promoting any kind of legal reform to deal with what many see as a strong progressive bias throughout the legal field now?
There's the Campaign for Liberty, which Norm Singleton heads. Ron Paul, he used to be the legislative director for Ron Paul. There are many libertarian legal organizations that sue the government variously. There are people like me who, my whole career, I've been suing the government. I did it even though I'm doing it in a for-profit mode. I'm representing companies and individuals and scientists who have been restricted or censored or have had their lives altered fundamentally without just cause. And I've spent 35 years suing the government. So there are precious few of us, I might add, but there are those who are swinging the axe in the other direction. I think the greatest opportunity for legal reform to protect the Constitution has to arise from a popular movement to clip the wings of the Democrats and to replace them with Republicans, and to bring about, and I say that only because today the Democratic Party is synonymous with the far left, and the Republican Party is the only vehicle left for us to effectively alter that course. But when we put in a majority who are dedicated to elimination of the administrative state, which is I advocate, and restoring the rule of law and positive law instead of prior restraints as the normative way of proceeding, then we might have a chance of putting back the power into the limits just defined by the Constitution, and creating a nation where liberty is the most precious value that is protected by the state. The state should be in the business of limiting its powers to protect the expansion of liberty. We should constantly be mindful that the Constitution meant for the individual to be sovereign, but with that sovereignty comes individual responsibility. And it also, you carry with that the burden of your own baggage and your own problems. So you can't look to have a nanny state. And we have to divorce the public of the idea that the nanny state can cause them to have a higher standard of living. I think the typical person out there today actually believes that you can have a wealthy existence if only the government redistributes the wealth of the very smallest percentage of the population to the rest of the country. Now, as Margaret Thatcher said, the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money, to paraphrase her. And that's, of course, what happens as soon as you go through a couple of these rounds of destroying the wealth generating individuals and institutions and redistributing it to the population, you end up with everyone impoverished, because it's not enough to increase the economic circumstance of someone for a lifetime, let alone a year or two. And yet you've taken down the very engines of productivity and growth that are responsible for the generation of that income. So you end up like Venezuela in no time. And if they just think beyond the moment, get out of the haze of the COVID lockdown environment and accept a minimal dose of realism, they should come to the conclusion that it's been a pipe dream that they've been sold by the Democratic Party, and that pilfering other people's goods and services to the nth degree is no way to ensure the creation of goods and services. It's the best way to destroy them.
Jason, you want to jump in there?
Well, it's sort of a follow-up question to what the question asked and a response to Jonathan. So Jonathan, my question is, when I read your book, I read about Wilson and more particular, the president that you've defined as the worst president, giving away a little bit of your book, but not why, is Franklin D. Roosevelt. My question to you is, it reads like there's been a sort of moral eugenics program that's been foisted on the American people, where this sort of entitlement mentality and this sense of entitlement is seen as a birthright. So my question is, how do we undo, or how is that entitlement mentality undone? Is it simply by removing the poison, which is the welfare state? Or is there something like a re-socialization of people's sensibilities? I don't believe in government-funded schools anymore. I used to at one time. I've been converted through reason and through observation. But it's a serious question that I'd like you to address. That is it just simply by implementing a kind of administrative body of administrative government that that is not predicated on the welfare state, that comes close to approximating capitalism, and through default, through force, through sheer necessity, people will be forced to revisit and to re-socialize themselves? Or is there some larger work that is to be done by intellectuals, by activists in reschooling people's sensibilities on a different level? Because I'll stop here, among other things, I came to this country 36 years ago under Mr. Reagan. And, I worked 45 hours to put myself through school before getting a scholarship to get my PhD, but I never for once, and the immigrants that of my generation, I'm 56, never thought that anything was owed to them by America. We just thought, keep out of our way, do not obstruct any efforts that we might manifest on behalf of our lives. And there's been a tremendous shift now where you have illegal immigrants who think they not only have the right to vote, but they also are entitled to a house and a job and a car and whatnot. So how do we begin this I call it sort of re-socialization? Maybe that's a mawkishly bad word, but how do we begin this process of shifting the sensibilities of people?
I think basic honesty is a good approach. And the truth is, if people will only listen to it, that socialism is a bankrupt idea. It just doesn't work. You can be promised any number of things, and you can view yourself as entitled to those things. But when they're given to you, they come at a cost. And that cost is either inflation or taxation or both. So it's a false paradigm. The idea that there is free education, free healthcare, free this and free that is entirely absurd, because it's not free. Anything of value is not free. The question is, who bears the cost? Well, they're saying, well, I'm receiving these goods and I'm not bearing the cost, so I'm all for it. But what they don't understand is that they are actually paying for these goods, and they're paying for it in a series of ways that are indirect, but very, very devastating to them. And those ways are: 1, inflation; 2, taxation; 3, the reduction in innovation and the sophistication of the care with which they will get, because they're going to get rationed care, or they're going to get rationed education. They're going to get less quality. There can be universality, but it will be at an enormous expense that's unsustainable, and with a degree of quality that is a modicum of above nothing, so that you end up with false promises. You either go through this horror like Venezuelans, and you accept it because you're unwilling to have your mind open to the reality, the truth, or you can do something else, which this is where I think you come in, Professor Hill, in your books, and where politicians ought to be taking a lesson from you and from others, that this is an opportunity society. That is to say, so long as you are free, you can achieve. And that every time you create an artificial paradigm that limits your potential and then adopt it as law, you are artificially preventing us from enjoying those natural fruits that come from our freedoms. I mean, to be free to innovate without excessive regulation enables you to overcome all sorts of things. If the only limitation that I have is not on my freedom of speech and not on my ability to innovate, but simply on the extent to which I can comprehend something, I'm in as free a state as possible and in the best position to maximize my own self-interest and benefit and health and everything else. So if we focus on an opportunity society, on the notion that if you have a free market that is maximized and a government that's minimized, you will have the greatest opportunity, the greatest diversity of products, goods, services, the greatest innovation, the greatest chance to raise the standard of living, and that has historically been the case. That while you may not understand or agree with the invisible hand concept of Adam Smith, it is very much true. And the reason why it's true, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to jump in there to respond to Professor Hill's question. And I have agree with you on the whole. I've perhaps a slightly different take on it, because I think we do need to discuss the economic consequences. We do need to provide historical context. I think we need to talk about the law and talk about legal remedies. But at the end of the day, I think it's absolutely vital, because we have been doing that. Cato Institute has been around. You were there, I was there. There are a lot of groups making, the sort of economic policy arguments, but without really making the moral case to say, even though Venezuela is right there for you to see, even though North Korea is right there for you to see, even though Cuba is right there for you to see, we don't even have to agree on whether or not factually, historically, socialism fails. Let's put a pause in that. Let's just put that in the parking lot. And let's address the question about the morality of socialism, about whether or not it is right to be able to take from one person in order to give to another person, whether one as an individual has the right to determine their own autonomy and make decisions for themselves. So I guess that's why I'm at the Atlas Society, because I believe that no one better than Ayn Rand made the case, and not just made the case in terms of the facts. She made it in a way that was designed, to appeal to people's imagination, which was designed to excite them, to intrigue them, to seduce them. And I think that those who want to solve this problem really do need to think about, how do we reach young people? And, we can say, read a book. And I think I do want young people to read a book, and that's why we have our book club. But in terms of actually getting through to them as if our lives depended on it, and it does. Finding ways to make it in their self-interest, make it delightful, make it fun, make it something that's entertaining for them. And I think that's part of our challenge as well. So we have another question here, going back to law from YouTube. Peter Meteor asks, civil versus common law. Why is the mix of the two? Why do lawyers have their own language? Why can we no longer enter into courts without filing paperwork created by the bar? Who runs the courts? So.
Okay. If I can speak just a little bit to this point that you're raising about morality before I address that question.
Sure.
I quite agree with you. I think that there are many ways into this, but one way is the recognition that there's certain fundamental truths. I mean, most people do not dispute that we are born with free agency, or should be free. That is to say, that individual freedom of choice is a defining characteristic of humanity. We wish to choose of our own accord and not have someone else dictate to us what we should choose. This is an underlying indirect argument that is raised by the BLM people and critical race theory people and so on, that slavery is evil. Why is slavery evil? Because you have a master who denies you your individual liberty, who victimizes you and subjects you to their will. What we need to understand, and what our young people need to appreciate, is that it is morally evil in the same way as slavery to have the state be your master, to have the state take away from you freedom of choice, and have the state dictate to you the direction of your life, what you may hear, what you may think about, what you may communicate about. All of those things, cancel culture, this whole environment where dissent is not tolerated, means that you as an individual are less valuable. You have less freedom. You are sacrificed for someone else's view of what the common good is. And it's not just a view, it becomes the law, and it becomes imposed upon you. Now, shifting to, so it is immoral, absolutely, but it's immoral fundamentally because it divorces from humanity that characteristic that defines them, which is free agency. It takes away from you freedom. It circumscribes your freedom ever more until you end up being just a tool or an instrument or a robot of the state. And that is what you should fear most, because once you lose your control, you are indeed a slave, and you have no ability to rise to a level of happiness or self-fulfillment, because you're fulfilling the happiness of that person who gets to rule. That's it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an excellent point in terms of connecting. Slavery is a moral evil, and then going deeper, why and what is the fundamental principle. And I think that's part of what we tried to do with one of our animated videos on slavery, on Frederick Douglass. My name is Frederick Douglass, and it was interesting in the process to also learn that he was a contemporary with socialism and had something to say about it, and described socialism as slavery of all to all, and as aberrant nonsense. So,
yeah. John, as I explained in the book, John C. Calhoun's mudsill theory, which Abraham Lincoln refuted, is exactly the struggle between socialism and capitalism, essentially, between a defense of free labor and the argument for slavery, the contrary, which Calhoun was justifying. So very much socialism is woven into all of this and stands for the defense of slavery. But the question that was asked about civil versus common law. So Common law is simply judge-made law. That is to say, when parties are in court contesting against one another, the law will be before the judge, but the judge may act in ways that fill in the interstices between the law and the facts that are unique in a certain case. That breadth or extension of law in decisions of a court constitute a common law. That is the English heritage that we acquired. And so then the civil law or positive law created by legislatures is the other form of law. And then we have a third form that is not a part of the question, but that is important to recognize. I believe it to be a third form of law, and that's regulatory law, which constitutes prior restraints. What we want is to ensure that we don't have a collectivist law. That is to say, in the classical understanding, the law stands as a marker and individuals are assessed against it as to whether they have acted lawfully or unlawfully. But under the laws of the regulatory state, broad proscriptions, prior restraints are enacted, and all who transgress those restraints are considered law violators, whether their actions are themselves culpable or not. So a person, for example, could be completely, as one of my clients, I explained this in the Authoritarians, completely innocent of any wrongdoing, who created a means to cause what would be non-biodegradable plastics to become biodegradable. And that innovation threatened industry that had certain forms of biodegradable plastics that were not as competitive as this, actually not as good. And they resorted to lobbying the FTC, and the FTC adopted a rule that arbitrarily defined anything that did not completely break down into nature, into elements within 1 year of disposal could not be marketed as biodegradable. That remains the law to this day. And so something that would biodegrade over a long period of time, but nonetheless would save the environment of conventional plastics, would have huge value and would be understood to be biodegradable by every scientific definition or every understanding. But this arbitrary limit then is used to rule out everybody, whether they're helping, whether they're telling the truth or not, simply because it violates a decree. So that is unlike something, because it's not the product of elected representatives who are accountable to the people and can be removed from office, but an unelected bureaucracy that is in perpetuity capable of instituting restrictions that direct the nation into a quote unquote common good defined by the political leaders of these agencies who are unelected, non-accountable. It creates another area of law. So those are the differences. Civil law tends to be positive law. Common law is the filling in of the law by judges who decide in a case-by-case manner. And then the regulatory law, which is comprised of prior restraints, which cause those who are innocent of any culpable action, nonetheless, to be considered law violators. And to be given none of the constitutional protections, by the way, that Article 3 courts have under the Constitution, or even the 4th, 5th, 6th amendments to the Constitution. They're inapplicable in the regulatory law context, even though property is taken away and liberty is taken away by the regulatory state.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jason, did you want to jump in?
Well, I want to ask a very general question.
Please.
C. Bradley Thompson wrote a book called America's Revolutionary Mind, and which is a very good book that I interviewed him also for. So he thinks, that there is something quite American about America's founding fathers that we are the legatees of, and we have embodied something called uniquely the American mind, which is very different from Canada. Trudeau says that we are identityless people and we have no identity. And I said poof to that. So my question to Jonathan is, do you think there's something that is that we can call uniquely the American mind, A, and B, do you think America, as we stand today, with the authoritarian movements, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, certain white supremacist movements, just the authoritarian movements that are on the run, especially galvanized by this administration, I think. Has America lost? So do you think that there is something unique about them? Is there an American mind that you can spot? And has America lost its American mind? Are we in danger of losing our American mind right now?
Well, there is a uniquely American legal and social construct that arises from our tradition in defense of individual liberty, that is most aptly described, and I agree with Professor Thompson in this respect, in the Declaration of Independence. In the second paragraph of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson brilliantly summarized the essence of America for all time. And that brilliant exposition in the second paragraph is etched on the DNA of every person who is an American, whether grafted onto America or born here. It's why we come here if we're not from here. It's why we are proud of ourselves if we live here. And I say ourselves because you can't derive a sense of self-worth from something that someone else gave to you by virtue of the exercise of state power. You derive a sense of self-worth by that pursuit of happiness that is referenced in the Constitution, understood in Lockean terms to be your effort that has been expended based on your intelligence, based on your physical talent, based on your sweat. It is that effort that gives you a sense of self-worth when in the end, what you have produced is appreciated by others and causes others to experience a benefit of one kind or another. And that is understood all over the world, but it's understood to be uniquely American in the sense that here you're supposed to be able to do that without being lorded over constantly by government. So now we have a class, and I think we can exaggerate their significance. I think that Joe Biden sold his soul to the socialists, and he has a socialist government, is not indicative of what the American people think or believe. And I think what you'll find is that like Abraham Lincoln found, even in the midst of the Civil War, even with the socialism that was driving the South as a defense of slavery, Hegelian socialism, as I talk about in the Authoritarians, you find that there are these mystic chords of memory, as he referred to, that tie us back to the Declaration. It is very hard to have an understanding of America and not appreciate that our greatness is tied inextricably to our liberties. We are only great because we're free. We only have Hollywood because they're free. They have freedom of speech. We only have a diverse culture because we have freedom of religion and because we have this idea of property rights where individuals can actually own something for themselves. Not everywhere in the world can you say that. And when you combine all of these freedoms, life, liberty, and property, you have a fulsome defense of individuality. Because all of these are individual rights. We have to remember that rights, we don't share a notion of collective rights. Joe Biden may believe in collective rights. Kamala Harris may believe in collective rights. Governor Newsom may believe in collective rights. The squad may believe in collective rights, but the American people don't believe in collective rights. They believe they go to work and they earn something for themselves and their families. They're driven to achieve by two factors principally: to make something of value for others, that is to really make something cool. And then the other thing is to feed their families, to feed themselves, and to acquire wealth, because they want to have an existence that is defined by greatness or exceptionalism. That's what drives Americans. That's why other people outside the United States want to come here. They want to come here because they want to experience that. They want to have something of their own. They want their own plot of land. They want their own home. They want to have their own car. They want to have these physical things, but they also want to have pride, self-pride. They want to believe that they're doing something to help the world. And that can be anything from building a home or working on an assembly line or being a lawyer or being a professor or whatever. It's just, that's where we are unique. We are driven to exceptionalism. We work harder than anyone else in the world. And we do so because we are in so many respects selfless, in the sense that we're giving all of this, but we're actually selfish because we expect that if we work hard enough and if we give enough and if we change the world and make it a better place, that in the end we'll be benefited. Bill Gates may have forgotten how he got there, but he wanted to make a fortune, but he wanted to do it the old-fashioned way. He didn't get it from government. He got it because he innovated and because he became a master of the market and because he hustled and was competitive. And he did that to build an empire, which he, I believe, wanted to build because it would be great for him, but he also brought up a whole lot of people with him. But once you get there, I guess you can afford to be woke, or you can have grandiose ideas that maybe it's not enough to be the head of a major international corporation. Maybe you need to rule the world. So there's a little bit of danger there too, right? But for the average American, I think they are still adherents of the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. And I think that it defines most of us. I think that these radicals who are pushing in the other direction are a minority. And I think they've pushed it probably too far. And I think we may see that in the midterm elections. Maybe not. Maybe we need more socialism before we recognize its swill and regurgitate it out. But I think that we're probably already there.
Jonathan and Jason and those joining us, we have just a few more minutes. There's another interesting question, and also if we had time, I wanted to see Jonathan, maybe just a real nutshell kind of explanation of the link between slavery and socialism, kind of plantation socialism. For those who have yet to read your book, perhaps give us a teaser on that. But I wanted to get to another question on YouTube from Scott, in part because Jason and I are going to be talking about this tomorrow on Clubhouse and unpacking Jason's great question, great article that he recently did on critical race theory and moral extinction. So I'm going to ask our gremlins to also throw the links both for our Clubhouse chat and to Jason's article into our chat stream. But the question from Scott is, what is the relationship between critical race theory and critical legal theory? And how pervasive is critical legal theory within law schools today?
Critical legal theory is very pervasive, and it was when I went to law school, and it has been since the 80s. Martin, or I think it, well, it's not Martin Reddish. I was going to say Martin Reddish, but there's a Harvard professor whose name escapes me at the moment, who's the giant in the area of critical legal theory.
Derek Bell.
Pardon me?
Derek Bell. Is it Derek Bell?
Yes, Derek Bell for critical race theory too. But they call themselves initially differently. They referred to themselves as deconstructionists, or as essentially opponents of the Constitution, as it had the classical liberal view of the Constitution. And what they argued for in the area of the 14th Amendment and equal protection was this idea that the discrimination is not just overt action, that it is implicit, and that they created this whole argument of implied discrimination as their initial movement. And so they would argue, for example, that affirmative action was appropriate because even though you as an individual had never discriminated against someone in your life and happened to be white, you nonetheless should lose your place at the university in favor of someone who was of color because of the history of discrimination of the people who are of color. And even though you didn't actually intend to discriminate, there is an implied discrimination, and it's implicit in the institutions that surround us. And so critical race theory is simply an application of this socialist notion of critical legal theory. Again, why do I say socialist? Well, because they refer to oppressed and oppressors. They rather than having the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, they have as oppressed and oppressors, they have the people predicated upon race. So they imbued race into everything. They view everything as necessarily a distinction predicated upon race or gender. And they ascribe all manner of ills to what they say is an implied racism. And their cure for it is government power used to reorient our social relationships, our economic standing, and our political power. So when critical race theory comes along, this is really child abuse. And the reason why it's child abuse when it's an educational form is that it causes children of color to understand that no matter what they do in life, no matter what talents they have, no matter what education they acquire in detail, and no matter what their physical attributes, they nonetheless will be held back by whites because of systemic racism, which is said to imbue every single institution in society, government, the private sector, education, everything is systemically racist. Why? Because it's implicit. It's implicit in these institutions, and they're tainted inextricably and for all time because they were put together by a white supremacist society. And so then they take white children and they also engage in child abuse against them because they teach white children that they're oppressors and that no matter what they do, their pigment alone causes this oppression. It's implicit. It's implicit in their pigment. And so no matter what they do, wherever they are, they will be understood by those of color to be the oppressor. And they will always have a better shake at every opportunity in this white supremacist society. So this is what they teach kids. Now, what does this do? This causes children to hate themselves. It causes children to hate each other. It causes children to hate every institution. It causes children to hate our government. It causes them to hate the Constitution. In other words, they hate being Americans. So it's no surprise then that they become revolutionaries, which is what they want them to become. And the same was true of critical legal theory. As I was going through law school, I knew it was a bunch of rot, and I argued against it. But the fact of the matter was they were indoctrinating law students with a philosophy that was contrary to the Constitution, designed to destroy the Constitution as an impediment by causing these rising generation of attorneys to become activist, Marxist individuals. That was their hope and their goal, their aim. And it's very deceitful and it's very manipulative. And they distort history to achieve it. And they deny the truths that underlie the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And they ascribe racist motivations to everyone, every American hero, no matter who they are. And they make those racist connotations define the person, even though they may have been racist. You can't write someone off completely because of their time and their communication if they've offered a contribution, but they nonetheless completely ignore the contributions. But they also falsely declare that the founding fathers are racists. And in point of fact, they say that they were advocates of slavery, as Thompson points out in his book that Professor Hill mentioned. The history is to the contrary. They were advocates of the abolition of slavery. They wanted it done through political means. They realized that individually they couldn't do it and survive economically. And they were in that respect subject to fault, but certainly they can't be faulted for creating a Declaration of Independence that was overtly intended to be applicable to all mankind, men, women, people of all races. There's a 168-word paragraph to the Declaration that Jefferson wrote, which he condemns George III for the institution of slavery, and he refers to the rights of those who are in bondage. And those rights are directly referenced in the second paragraph. He meant for us to understand that all human beings are possessed of inalienable rights. It is false, a false statement that the Declaration was a racist document.
Well, thank you for that. We are perfectly at time. So I want to thank Professor Hill. Thank you, Jonathan. And I want to thank all of you who joined us and gave us your great questions. We are actually going to continue this conversation in a way tomorrow on Clubhouse with myself and Professor Hill. So please go to the Atlas Society's website, to our event section. I also think we just put it into our comment section, which you can see there. And I hope you'll join us. And if you are enjoying the work of the Atlas Society and believe in the importance of making the moral case imaginatively, creatively, with fun and entertainment, then consider supporting the Atlas Society with a tax-deductible donation. And we will also see you next week for our discussion on current events with the Atlas Society scholars. Thank you so much.
By Jonathan's book.
Absolutely. It's in the link. Okay, great. Thank you.